This week we're going back to school and talking about the basics of plot. Structure is the scaffold, and so we're going to be talking a lot about the structure today. But plot is the story. So today we're going to look at the scaffold so we have something to build our story on. And we're going to start with the very basics and work our way up. You can divide the basic plot into three elements and call them different things depending on who you're studying. But essentially the three breakdowns are the beginning, the middle, and the end, which is as basic as it gets, right? Some people call that the exposition, the conflict, and the resolution, or we have my personal favorite, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And yes, even non-dramatic works, non-scripts, can follow the three-act structure. We're going to start looking at the basics of the beginning, middle, and the end concept. And for an example, we're going to use a mystery as kind of to see how this would play out in a plot. So in the beginning, you have a crime committed, you have suspects and a sleuth introduced, and I say sleuth because it's not always a detective. Sometimes it's, a chef, a florist, particularly in the cozy mystery genre right now. And so we just say the sleuth, whoever that is. And then in the middle, we have an investigation, we have clues, and the stakes are raised for everybody in the plot. And then in the end, the crime is solved, the perpetrator is confronted. In other words, it's really the same as exposition, conflict, and resolution. So in exposition, that's just the setup to your story. And most books start with some form of exposition. What's happening, which is the plot, and who's it happening to, that's the characters. And then sometimes we also say you want to include your, it's the setup for the story, and it's what you'd also want to include setting elements in that. And then in the middle section, we have conflict, which is just introducing obstacles to the characters, which increases their tension and the tension for the reader. And then in the resolution, it's about making sure the problem is solved. So back to our murder mystery or mystery in general, the exposition is where the murder or the crime is set up. That's where you get the suspects, the detective. And it's where you're kind of demonstrating that you have both internal and external problems. So the external problem might be solving the mystery, but there's also an internal or emotional plot line that goes throughout the book. And then in the conflict, it's the initial investigation that leads to clues and increases the stakes, again, both for the external plot and the emotional plot. And then the resolution is where they solve the crime and achieve whatever their internal desire is. But that's all very simplistic, and that was the point, is to get everybody on the same page about it. And then we're going to talk about this guy. His name is Gustav Freytag, and he decided that there were 5 parts to a plot. And you can see that on the Freytag's pyramid. We have exposition, which sets up the story again, characters, conflict, and setting. And then we have rising action, which is where we start to see complications. The conflict affects the characters and complicates their lives. And complications are always the best thing for writers. The climax is the peak on that pyramid that he has. It's the most dramatic turning point in the story. So this is the high point where the character faces a conflict and wins. But so like in Star Wars, it would be when Luke uses the Force to blow up the Death Star. That's the climax. And you'll notice with contemporary plotting, that climax goes a little bit to the right of the pyramid. And then we have falling action, which is the slowed action showing results or the fallout of the climax. And then the denouement or resolution is just that the story is tied up in conclusion. In our mystery example, the exposition would be much the same as it was in the previous 2 examples. So you have the setup for the crime, the suspects, the detective or the sleuth, and those internal and external problems. Rising action is what leads to the climax. And so this is the newer element. We were first looking at the 3 pieces. Now we've got 5. Rising action is the investigation and the clues, some that lead to success and others that lead to nowhere. And so we call this sort of the try-fail cycle, where the characters are trying different things. They're getting different clues. They're succeeding, they're failing, but they're learning the skills that they're going to need in order to overcome the big obstacle. And then the climax is the sleuth solves the crime. The falling action is where the sleuth and the rest of the characters have to deal with the fallout. And then the resolution is where it's all the loose ends are tied up and the problem is solved. So now we see that our simple 3-piece beginning, middle, and end has grown a little bit. And what I really want you to notice is that the fundamental structure remains the same as the beginning, the middle, and the end, but we layer in more detail. Sometimes we start to tell a story with just those three elements. We know it starts, we kind of know what's the high point, and we know the end. And that's okay. And then we start to layer in more details. So sometimes over time we layer in the rest. And so let's see how we layer things on a 3-act structure, because this is where you start to see it's almost like the beginning, middle, and end, or whatever 3 elements you're looking at, or Freytag's pyramid with the 5 elements. Those are just the mannequin. And now we're going to layer on some clothes and make that more whole, more human looking, as if you're looking at a mannequin. Oh, so in our murder mystery, there's the exposition, rising action, falling action, all the things that we just went over. All right, so plot, when you're looking at the 3-act structure, so fiction writers started with the previous, particularly Freytag's pyramid, and then dramatists and scriptwriters broke their story into 3 acts, which is much the same. We've got a setup, confrontation, and resolution. At its most basic, it's very similar to the beginning, middle, and end, or exposition, climax, and resolution. But we're going to make it more complicated, I promise. All right, so in the basic 3-act structure, you'll notice a few key dots or squares that represent more specific elements within the 3-act structure. So we know that Act 1 is the setup, but then you'll notice that little dot in the center is the inciting incident. And the inciting incident is the event that propels the plot. So it could be a bomb, a death, a murder, a broken heart. Depends on your story and what kind of story it is, but this is what gets the action moving. So Act 1 is where you have exposition, where you're establishing your character, your conflict, and your setting, but then you also have that inciting incident that's going to stir up trouble. And then you'll notice this square at the end of Act 1. It says plot point 1. It's sometimes called turning point 1. And this is a turning point, or plot point is where the plot turns. And so at the end of Act 1, you have turning point 1, which twists the plot in a new direction, which then leads to the rising action. So this is the moment that shifts the story into gear. There's no going back for the character. And then after that twist is where you see rising action. And then at the midpoint, it really stays the same. It's your climax. And then you have, even though it's not listed on here, you also have falling action here. And then you reach plot point 2, or turning point 2. This is the moment that twists the plot in a new direction, excuse me, propelling the story toward the conclusion. So think of this as a story twist that leads us to answers at the end. And then we have resolution. Then we have the climax and then the resolution at the end. And so the midpoint doesn't always, and particularly in contemporary movies, you'll see the climax very close to the end like that. All right, so that's the basics of 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end, but then we also have an inciting incident, a midpoint, and a climax, and we have the turning points that twist the action into a new direction. Now we're going to look at a more complicated model. So you notice we're layering in more details to help you flesh out your story a little bit. There's many different forms that take on the basic 3-act structure. I prefer Christopher Vogler's. He wrote The Hero's Journey, or The Writer's Journey, because it's based on mythology. And as we've discussed, or should have discussed in storytelling, mythology tells stories the way we're wired to hear them. So for me, this is a perfect blend of the 3-act structure and Crohn's wired for story. Christopher Vogler also overlaps his stages on top of the basic 3-act structure. So that's the frame on which we're going to build. So you notice we've got the beginning, the middle, and the end, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. He labels his a little bit differently. So instead of in the 3-act structure, we have setup, confrontation, and resolution. He calls his ordinary world, special world, and then ordinary world. And we'll see what that means here in a second. So the hero's journey follows mythological structure. And because most mythology that survived, like there may be tons that was lost through time, but mythology that has survived has learned over time to present story in the way the listener or the reader needed to hear it. And so what Vogler did was he looked at Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he applied it to contemporary script writing, and now we also apply it to novel writing. And so when he says ordinary world, this is where the character starts in real life. And in mythology, if you think about it, there's always this ordinary world of the mythological hero. So we see Hercules in his real world, and then we have a special world, which is his quest, and then he returns back to the ordinary world. So the first thing in Act 1 is what we call the ordinary world. So the hero, possibly uneasy, uncomfortable, or unaware, is introduced sympathetically so the audience can identify with the situation or dilemma. So we're showing the hero against the backdrop of the environment, heredity, and personal history as he is right now. Some kind of duality or polarity exists in the hero's life, pulling him in different directions and causing that tension or the stress. So in our mystery example, this is the pre-crime ordinary world of our sleuth, be they a detective, a chef, a bag lady. This is the life of the person who's the protagonist with a vested interest in the outcome. And then after we see what the ordinary world is like, we have a call to adventure. So something shakes up the situation, either from external pressures or from something rising up deep internally. So the hero must face the start of a change. And so in a mystery novel, that would be the crime is committed. That's usually the call to action. We also have, and not every story follows this, we call it refusal of the call. So this is where the hero feels the fear of the unknown and tries to turn away from the adventure, however briefly. And so your character can refuse a call and say, you know what, I really don't want to go on a quest like this. This is if you think of the biblical story of Job, his first answer was, no, I don't think so. So it's a refusal of the call. It can be, if the character doesn't do it, it could be that another character expresses uncertainty and danger ahead so that the character is at least considering refusing the call. And so in a mystery, that might be, oh, let the police handle it. Like, I'm not, like, this isn't my job. I'm going to refuse this, let the police handle it. And then we have, and these can be mixed around in some form, but then we also have a meeting with a mentor. The hero comes across a seasoned traveler of the world who gives him or her training, equipment, and advice that will help on the journey. So the hero reaches within to a source of courage and wisdom if they don't have a mentor. And so, like in the James Bond movies, it's where he goes to CQ and he gets all those cool gadgets, or he gets the intel briefing. In our mystery, that could be the meeting with the mentor. It could be a police person, a wise neighborhood gossip, somebody who gives them special knowledge or special skills to take on the quest. And then we see where turning point 1 was on the 3-act structure. We see crossing the threshold. And that's really when, at the end of Act 1, the hero commits to leaving his ordinary world and entering a new region or condition with unfamiliar rules and values. So this is where, okay, fine, I'll solve the crime. This is the turning point that twists us into the action of Act 2. In Act 2, previous types of plotting called this rising action. Vogler calls it tests allies and enemies. This is basically where the character is tested. He figures out who his allies are and who his enemies are. If you think mythology, this is where sort of he gathers a crew to go with him, or he figures out who the bad guys are. And so the hero is tested, and he creates alliances or allegiances in the special world. So we have often, for mystery in this test allies and enemies, we have danger, false clues, near misses. It's that try-fail cycle. I'm going to try this. Oh, that didn't work. Try this. Oh, that worked well. And so the character's learning how to solve the crime. And then who's going to be there to help the character and who's going to be there to hinder the character. The approach is more rising action, but here the hero and his newfound allies prepare for the major challenge in the special world. So stakes are rising, and now failure is less of an option. So we're getting closer to that midpoint climax, and the approach is where something like the loved one is accused. There's some red herrings. There's a threat to our sleuth in some way. So things are getting more dangerous and more tense for our main character. And then the ordeal sits at that midpoint. It's near the middle of the story. The hero enters a central space in the special world and confronts death or faces his or her greatest fear. Out of this moment of death comes a new life. I use Star Wars in this example because it's really easy to see. It's when they're in the trash compactor, and it's that midpoint where it's a big obstacle. It is life or death. And then, yes, of course, the hero shockingly survives. Not everybody does, depending on the type of book, but the main character usually survives. In a mystery, it's when your sleuth character, faces the big obstacle. There's a life or death struggle and comes out the winner. So it's very similar to the climax. This might be where they put together who is at fault. That doesn't mean the person has been accused, but they've got this big reveal that they survive. They survive ultimate, potential death so that they can bring the criminal to justice. And so the reward is sort of the falling action. It's where the hero takes possession of the treasure won by facing death. There may be acceleration. There's also danger in losing the treasure again. So in a mystery novel, we may now know who the killer is, but the danger could or the knowing this could bring danger to the main hero and risk the life of the sleuth. So there's a reward. Yes, I know who it is, but then also the potential for danger. And then notice at the end of Act 2, Vogler calls it the road back. This is really your second turning point. It's typically 3/4 of the way through the story. In some mysteries, it's much closer to the end where we have the road back. The hero's driven to complete the adventure. He leaves the special world to make sure that the treasure is brought home. So in an action movie, this is the chase scene that signals the urgency and the danger of the mission as we're heading back home with whatever there is. So if you think about literally in Star Wars, the road back is them getting those plans back to the Resistance. And in our mystery, turning point 2 would be returning to the regular world with the knowledge of who the criminal is, and basically going to the police or whatever confrontation is going to bring this criminal to justice. Immediately after returning to the ordinary world, we have the resurrection. So at the climax, the hero is severely tested once more on the threshold of home. He or she is purified by the last sacrifice, another moment of death and rebirth, but on the higher, more complex level. By the hero's actions, the polarities that were in conflict at the beginning are finally resolved. So in a mystery, this is the final confrontation with the killer. Typically it's with the killer, like it's anticlimactic if they just get arrested and there's no last conflict. So this is the final confrontation with the killer. This is another moment of potential death and rebirth for the like this is when the villain has that last gasp of trying to survive by killing the person who knows what's going on. And then at the very end of Act 3, we have return with the elixir. So the hero returns home or continues the journey bearing some element of the treasure that is the power to transform the world as the hero has been transformed. So in our mystery, so in Star Wars, it's obviously they bring the plans back to the Resistance, and that leads to the ultimate conclusion. In a mystery, it's solving the crime, protecting the community, and the reward is something like maybe not going to prison for a crime they didn't commit, or saving a loved one or a friend from going to prison. So that's the way it would work in a murder mystery. Not a single one of these plot structures is right or wrong. In some cases, it's a matter of your personal style. But as you can see, each one grows from the previous. When we start with the simple beginning, middle, and end, and then we layer in the complexity, the conflict, add more elements to the story to make it fit the way the reader's brain is wired to hear the story. So the rest of today, we are going to play with plot and help develop our plot into something that is stronger and more complex than beginning, middle, and end.